coming. This is the Advanced Networks Colloquium. Today we have with us Milind Tambe, University of South California. So he is the Helen and Emmett Jones Professor in Engineering and Professor of Computer Science and Industrial Systems Engineering at the USC. He is very well known. He leads the Team Core Research Group at USC. He's a fellow of the Association for Artificial Intelligence. And he has received the SEM SIGARD Autonomous Agents Research Award and also the Christopher Columbus Fellowship Foundation Homeland Security Award. So he's done an extensive amount of work in using game theory for security, and more importantly, he has applied it to particular real problems, right? We had GameSec here about a year ago with a wonderful speakers. Unfortunately, you couldn't come then, so glad we have him now. So today he will talk to us about security and game theory, key algorithmic principles, deployed applications, and lessons learned.
So thank you very much. So this is joint work with a lot of people. Some of my students and postdocs are pictured here. There are other former students and postdocs whose name are listed at the end, and also other collaborators at USC and beyond. So let me jump right into the topic. Security is a global concern. We have to protect our ports, our airports, our critical national infrastructure, intercept the illegal flow of drugs, weapons, and money, and protect our fish, forests, and wildlife. In all of these cases, we have limited security resources, which means that we have to engage in selective checking or monitoring. But our adversaries can observe our defenses and exploit any patterns. So for example, here's the Los Angeles International Airport. If we have one patrol unit, and it's always at 9 a.m. at Terminal 1, 10 a.m. at Terminal 2, 11 a.m. at Terminal 3, an adversary can observe that and exploit that pattern. In fact, over the history of LAX Airport, there have been 6 separate attempts to attack it. This is serious stuff with guns and bombs. 3 of them have succeeded, 3 were fortunately intercepted. And all of the perpetrators lived within 50 miles of the airport, giving them an ample opportunity to conduct surveillance. So we have this challenge of limited resources, a lot of things to protect, and an intelligent adversary who can observe what we do and then react. So we appeal to game theory for addressing the challenge of security allocation. The kinds of games that I'll use are called Bayesian Stackelberg games. We are going to use these games for security allocation using targets that have different weights and an opponent who can react. Some of you may be very familiar with Stackelberg games, but for those of you who may not be, this is a simple example. Imagine a very small port with just 2 targets, target 1 and 2. Target 1 happens to be more important than target 2. Now, if as a result, the Coast Guard always try to protect target 1, then an adversary observing that will attack target 2. So the adversary gets a positive reward of 1, the Coast Guard get a negative reward -1. If as a result the Coast Guard switch and they always try to protect target 2, again an adversary conducting surveillance will attack now target 1. So adversary again gets a positive reward, the Coast Guard get a negative reward. So any deterministic strategy an adversary conducting surveillance can defeat. If the Coast Guard were to use a mixed strategy, a randomized strategy, so that they are 60% of the time here and 40% of the time over there, then an adversary conducting surveillance will only know, yes, the Coast Guard are here 60% and they're 40%, but what they will do tomorrow remains unpredictable. This increases difficulty in adversaries planning an attack, increases the uncertainty and cost that an adversary faces, and therefore improves the Coast Guard expected reward. These kinds of games are called Stackelberg games because the security forces must commit first, and then the adversary responds. I will also refer to Bayesian games because there's a lot of uncertainty over adversary types, and I'll come to that a little bit later. What we are interested in is optimal allocation of our limited security resources. So I said 60-40 as allocation of our resources. The 60-40 may not be optimal. It might be 70-30. It might be 80-20. For a 2x2 game, we can solve this very quickly by hand. But when you have billions of patrolling strategies, potentially, or more, and large numbers of targets, the problem becomes very difficult to solve. In fact, it's known that these kinds of games, to find the strong Stackelberg equilibrium of these games, or these Bayesian Stackelberg games, is an NP hard problem. So the contributions of my research group have been in coming up with fast algorithms, typically exploiting the structure of the problem in order to generate solutions that could be used.
So when you say optimal, it's not necessarily an equilibrium.
It is this, you'll see, we'll use different notions of equilibrium. One that you'll see used often is the strong Stackelberg equilibrium. And so what this means is it's optimal for the defender. And you will see this getting worked out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in the rest of this presentation, I'll start with our deployed real-world applications. And I'll ask for your patience as I go through these applications, because I'm sure you'll think about lots and lots of research challenges. And that's what I'll get to next, talking in particular about challenges of scale-up and uncertainty. And then I'll spend the last 10 minutes of my presentation talking about evaluation of this work. This work's being published in the normal venues for artificial intelligence, AMAS, HGI, AAAI, EGI, and so forth. There's about 40 papers on this topic since 2006. And there's also this book which collects key papers, also commentary from domain experts and so forth. And so if a lot of copies of this book sell, then the goal is that from the royalties, me and my students will go out on a nice dinner cruise in Marina del Rey. And if not many copies sell, then it's rice and dal at our home. So we'll see how it goes. So we'll start with these deployed real-world applications. So the first one that we've developed is something called ARMOR. This is for the Los Angeles International Airport. There's 6 inbound roads into LAX, but not enough officers to have a checkpoint on all roads at all times. There's 8 terminals, but not enough dogs to have canine units patrolling all terminals at all times. So the question then becomes, where and when should they set up checkpoints? Where and when should the canine units patrol? We solve this problem using this notion of Stackelberg games that I just talked about. And this produces a mixed strategy for the police from which we sample, and then we get a patrolling schedule, or schedule for setting up checkpoints. The system has been operational at LAX since August of 2007. We had a Blue Ribbon Commission examine LAX security last year, and one of the recommendations was that the ARMOR program continue. I have a small video here from a local news station. This is from 2009. I've trimmed it down to just about 45 seconds, so you may find it bearable. But it has some video that I couldn't go out and capture myself.
Decisions about where and when and for how long the checkpoints appear are now computer generated by a specially designed program called ARMOR. First, randomized checkpoint schedules seem to be paying off. There have been 7 seizures so far this year. In January, 22 guns, including assault rifles, and 1,000 rounds of ammunition were seized from one man's pickup. ARMOR is the real-world result of theoretical work at USC.
So I'll, of course, do a more detailed evaluation of this work a little bit later on. Following ARMOR, the next deployment was with the Federal Air Marshals Service. Some of you may know these are secret gun-carrying police on planes. And the challenge there, we're looking at the international sector, is there's 3,000 flights, international flights a day by US carriers, but not enough air marshals to be on all flights. So the question then becomes, again, how do you deploy air marshals on flights? There's also websites called Spot the Air Marshal websites. There's also a threat that the airline employees may give away locations of patterns of how air marshals deploy. So there's a sense of an insider threat potentially as well. And so the goal for the Federal Air Marshals Service, again, is to randomize allocation of air marshals to flights, taking into account the fact that different flights have different risks. A flight going from New York to London on Christmas Day has a different appeal potentially to an attacker than a flight that may be going to a small city in Canada. So again, this problem was solved. We solved it using Stackelberg games. This is a system that's been deployed since October of 2009. It continues to expand its role. We may be going into allocations of the domestic sector in the next year and so forth. And so let me now speed up and just go through some other applications. The big one for us, and I'll show you a video a little bit later on if we have time, is for the US Coast Guard. We've deployed a Protect system. This is for randomizing patrols of the Coast Guard in the ports of Boston, New York, and the goal here, having done Boston and New York, is to go to all of the ports in the country. And this is something that's going to get started starting in 2013 to deploy this nationwide. With the trust system, this is for the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. You know, we have a training system in Los Angeles. Some of you may not know this. But it's a barrier-free system, which means that people can get on the trains and get off the trains without buying a ticket. Yes, I mean, you know, they're supposed to, but they may not. There's no physical barrier to stop them. So the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department then goes and does randomized checks to make sure there's deterrence and people buy tickets. So again, there's a question of where and when should we do these checks, and that's the problem that we've solved for them. But this is going to go into fighting crime and so on and so on. One of the ways in which this deployment proceeds is that we develop the software, we give it to them, then work with it, they'll come back to us saying that there's some issues, and we refine the software as well.
So in this particular case, do you also give advice in the fine they give people when they report them?
That's a good question. So that's an area that we've not looked into. Potentially one could also look at the amount of fine that would lead to, so sort of could come out of it. But that's not been in our jurisdiction, let's say. I mean, our role has been, just to build this program to tell them how to optimize their checks. But that could be another way that we could implement, but that's just not what we've been asked to do. So it's not.
The question I have is, in these 4 projects, how much involvement is there with behavioral scientists, sociologists, because there's a lot of human behaviors play.
Of course. And I'll come to a whole section. So there's multiple theses that have been written on dealing with human subjects, and so I work very closely with the psychologist Richard John, who's co-author of the papers and so on. It's a very interdisciplinary effort, and you see that a lot of influences from many different fields are necessary. So within this, though, one of the chief complaints, or one of the complaints turned out to be that the schedules were too long, so we had to shorten them. The schedules had no bathroom breaks. So one of our recent papers is talking about introducing bathroom breaks in Stackelberg equilibrium. And so that's something I'm sure Stackelberg had not thought about when he thought about Stackelberg games. But these are practical constraints that must be handled. So these are 3 systems that are deployed. This one is under evaluation. But there's many, many more of potential applications and current ongoing applications. For the TSA, we've built a system called guards. This is for checking the airport, not checking passengers. This is under evaluation, again, for national deployment. With the Coast Guard, one of the worries they have is the ferry traffic in New York or Seattle. There's because these ferries are crowded, for example, that this could present attractive targets for a suicide boat launch. And so these escort boats could be used for randomized protection of these ferry traffic. And that's one of the things that we've designed, and this may go into operation in 2013. With the World Bank, we are looking at protecting forests, such as the forest in Laos. Also, there's a lot of concern about protecting tigers, which are becoming extinct. The Coast Guard are worried about the protection of our fish, because of overfishing, we may just not leave any fish for our future generations and so forth. All of these are interesting challenges where our fields, algorithmic game theory, computational game theory, and all the interdisciplinary fields could contribute ways in which efficiency could be generated for protecting these natural resources. And finally, so whereas I talked about deployed applications, these are kind of under evaluation, and we'll see where they, how they evolve. This one is under discussion, with some papers written, but a lot more to be done. This is again a interesting project that came out where we've written a couple of papers, but certainly very far away from anything like deployment. So when Major Benjamin Hung returned from Afghanistan after having deployed there for a mission for winning hearts and minds, and so his goal was to go around Afghanistan visiting different villages and convincing people to essentially support the US and stop the influence of the Taliban. And of course the Taliban are doing the exact opposite to his mission. And so he wrote a wonderful master's thesis of how you could do it after having returned from Afghanistan by looking at nodes in a social network that maximize social influence. But we took again theoretic perspective because clearly this would be a game with the Taliban influencing in the opposite way. And so we would generate a randomized strategy for how these villages could be visited in order to influence the local leaders to maximize social influence, taking into account the fact that the opponent is trying to do the opposite. But as I said, this is very, very far away from anything like deployment. So these are some of the applications that are motivating our work. So next I wanted to talk about research challenges. And you'll notice here it's all red, gold, underlined, and I've done everything I could to this font in order to emphasize the fact that these are not solved challenges. These are research challenges. Indeed, for the sake of my PhD students who are yet to get their PhDs, we want these challenges to not have been solved already. We have made progress over what was there before, but there's a lot more that needs to be done. I'll outline two, I'll emphasize two. One is scale up and the other is uncertainty. With respect to scale up then, why is this a big challenge? If we think about the number of defender actions, just with 100 flights and 10 air marshals, that's 100 choose 10. That's 10 to the power 13 different combinations right there. But in reality, as we said, there's a lot more number of flights. If we think about an adversary attacking a city, there's a lot of ways an adversary could enter a city. Again, there's a lot of different adversary actions. And there could be a scale up in number of adversary types. In addressing these challenges, I'll highlight some main ideas that we've used. One is problem decomposition, which exploits type independence for speed up. Second is marginals from its strategies, which uses target independence. And then column generation or double oracle approach, which uses the fact that the mixed strategies often have small support. And I'll explain these ideas in some detail, but since this is a summary of a lot of different papers, I wouldn't be able to go into sort of the real details of every paper, but hopefully I'll convey enough that you get a sense of where it is that we are going and what kinds of ideas we are exploiting in scaling things up. If you read our papers, actually you will see names of algorithms like origami and recon and hunter and so forth. So these are clever acronyms that get generated at 2 a.m. in the morning when the paper deadline is at 3 a.m. And this is because after all the hard work that's been put into the paper, there's a thought that if only the algorithm had a nice name, it would all make the paper excellent. One would think that an extra experimental result in that 1 hour would improve the paper some more. But instead, the effort is spent in coming up with a name, and I'll go with that. But in the talk, I will not refer to the names of the algorithms. I will instead use the names of the systems in which these algorithms are used. So the first system we built was for the LAFC airport. And the concern here is of multiple adversary types. There was a Millennium bomber who wanted to pancake the international terminal. There was a local gang which wanted to attack some parts of LAX and so forth. So there are different adversary types with different potential motivations. Now, if you wanted to take a Bayesian game of this form, so we are going to say there's a red adversary type with a probability of 0.3, a blue one with a probability of 0.5, a black one with a probability of 0.2, and now you want to solve this game. Previously, the way you would do it is by constructing a Harsanyi transform game matrix, which generates this big game matrix of all possible combinations of adversary actions. And then this can be solved using previously known linear programming techniques. But this approach was slow, even for the LAX problem, which is now considered to be a very small problem. It's not fast enough for a sergeant to press a button and quickly get a response back. So we needed a different approach. And so we used the mixed entity programming approach. So I'll hopefully be able to give you a sense of what this is doing. so that you understand the main ideas here, but may not be able to really go deep into this. So we have these three adversary types. The main point I want to convey is that it's not taking as input the big Harsanyi transform game matrix, but it's really taking these three separate game matrices directly as inputs. So let's try to understand what this is trying to do, this ARMOR program. So these three adversary types are independent, and therefore we are going to play a strategy X, which independently optimizes against these three types. So that way we can keep the game matrices independent. But of course, the strategy we play, this X, is common against all different attacker types. So X1 here might be the probability that we put a dog on terminal 1 and a dog on terminal 2. X2 might be the probability that we put a dog on terminal 2 and a dog on terminal 3. So if we enumerate every single allocation of dogs to terminals and assign a variable x, xi, each of those allocations, that's what this formulation is trying to do. And then solve for that.
Your assumption is that the action you will take is uniform across types.
So the action we will take is, yeah, it is common. So we are going to take only one action, and all of the different types are going to observe what we are doing, what we've done, and then we act.
You don't take into account the fact that different types have maybe different modalities and different resources to implement whatever action they have.
So there, all of that would be captured inside of their payoff matrix. So if they have different capabilities, then that would all get captured in the payoff. So that's the way we would capture it. And so having observed our mixed strategy, then each adversary type will respond. And in this case, we assume that the adversary type will respond, for example, by attacking a single terminal. And so there's going to be this response, and then this final condition is mainly to make sure that the adversary's response is optimal against our action, the mixed strategy that we've generated. So we have optimal, we are trying to come up with a strategy, mixed strategy, taking into account the fact that the adversary is going to conduct surveillance, know this mixed strategy, and then react optimally to that. So this was sufficient as a... Yeah, so we generate one mixed strategy, and that's it. And then you sample from it.
And
Of course,
then you do it
they,
again, or what? Because they will change the
no, in this case, the way the scenario is supposed to work, or is from previous attacks and so forth, is that the adversary is going to conduct surveillance for long periods of time and then choose a single attack. So as such, we're not going to change our mixed strategy unless, so the passenger loads change from hour to hour, so we play the same strategy from hour to hour. The terminal, now LX is going through an expansion, and there's new constructions, of course, will change the game and all of that. So if things like that change, then the game changes. Otherwise, the game is for us the same.
Okay, and the question is also on the fail. How do you, I know that's some estimation, but how did you do the practice?
No, that is a very important question of how do you get these payoffs. So for some of these other applications that I'll talk about, for example, with the Coast Guard, there's a big database that we read from. So the database is not constructed by us, it's from them. And they have gone off and employed a set of risk analysts, a company of risk analysts, and for all the ports in the country, for every target, for every mode of attack, they have estimates of how many people will die, what the economic consequences will be, and all of that. All of that is converted into a single number, and that's the payoff that we need. But as you go, I mean, we understand that these payoffs are not precise, that there could be noise, and so a lot of research has gone into how do you handle these noisy payoffs, and so I'll talk about that.
Is the solution robust?
So you'll see newer methods that we've come up with that are more robust. So the first method, this one here, correctly observed, is not as robust, but newer research has really gone into trying to make things really robust, or trying to make things as robust as possible.
I can understand how these risk figures would be an approximation of your payoffs. What I'm having trouble with is how do you judge the adversary's motivations and therefore their payoffs?
Right, and so the assumption that we've made here is that there's a certain mode of attack that this particular agency is concerned about. In this particular case, for example, is the vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. And so in that case, the motivation is to maximize casualties at the airport. And so therefore, the motivation is encapsulated in terms of how many deaths would occur should such an attack occur at this time, at this terminal, and so forth. So that's the way in which we assume that the adversary's motivation is captured. And so for this method of attack, that's the motivation, and from there we're going to get the
That sounds almost like a zero-sum payoff.
almost, but there are differences, and and in many cases the game tends to have the zero-sum flavor, but there are differences. So for example, at LAX, one of the reasons the games turned out not to be zero-sum because was the sense that if an adversary is captured at a busy intersection or something like that, then that is still not a big loss because from the adversary's perspective, there's publicity, that's still a positive payoff. Whereas if the adversary may be captured at an isolated location, that's not such a big payoff to the adversary because then there may not be as much publicity associated with that. And so in that sense, since these are subjective utilities of parties from their own perspective, so this is not exactly zero-sum, but it tends to have a zero-sum flavor, and there's a particular class of games. So we specialize these games to so-called security games. And so it's not the full Stackelberg game in its full generality, but it's really these security games that tend to have a very special structure with a payoff, which are close to zero-sum, but aren't quite zero-sum. They're not strategic zero-sum, but they're different. And so there's a lot of very interesting things to be done with these. So that's what allows us to scale up in many circumstances.
Sorry. I have a question. So how could you guarantee that there is enough resources to guarantee the security? Otherwise, if you lack of resources, i.e. the expectation of the gain from the authority is some negative number, that's meaningless to have all the games.
Well, I mean, we are trying to optimize our performance, right? So given resources are limited. You cannot get away from that fact. I mean, we just don't have enough. And so we want to optimize the use of those resources. And so we will do the best we can with the resources we have. And yes, I mean, if we could have more, we could do a better job, but that's just the limitation we have to live with.
What do you do when you have ballooning attack?
So this,
A team.
right. So that that's a very interesting. So some of these algorithms are actually agnostic to. So it's a sort of saying that we are going to solve a general Stackelberg formulation, and so you could say that there's a team of attackers as long as you can sort of write up the game matrix, then we can solve it.
Again in the game.
Right. So, but in some cases we do specialize so that it's not. It's really assuming that there's going to be a single attack. And that's not here, but in the future, in some of the faster algorithms, we have had to do that. There's more work going on with my collaborators at Duke who are looking at teams of attackers and so on. So but that is really an interesting active area. But let me move on. There's a lot more I want to cover, and I'm really thankful for all the very, very interesting questions. But let me just push forward in the interest of time. The main point, the main weakness of this formulation from 2007 was the fact that we enumerated every single combination of allocation of defenders to targets and then associated a probability with each one of those. So this explicit enumeration tends to be its downfall. Specifically, when we went to Air Marshals, instead of 8 terminals and 4 K96 at LAX, we suddenly had 3,000 flights a day. So this clearly was a huge scale up. With just 100 flight tours and 10 Air Marshals, that 1.73 would take about 13 combinations. And if you feed this into armor, it will just quietly die. So the main idea is to not enumerate all of the different combinations. So we've used 2 ideas, marginals and branching price. Now marginals is not an idea that actually gets used, but it's an interesting idea, and Branch and Price builds on it. And Branch and Price is the actual idea that gets used, that's in use by the Irish program, which is in use by the Air Marshals. So let me talk about marginals quickly. So with Armor, if you wanted to assign 3 Air Marshals to 10 flights, you would generate all the 120 different combinations. So we are assigning Air Marshals to flights 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 8, 9, 10, and so forth. And we have a probability associated with each of these combinations, right? There's 120 such variables. This is what we would feed into Armor, and when there's 10 to the power 13 such variables, that's why the program is not going to run. But if you look more closely at the game matrix, there's a lot of duplicates. So for example, here we have combination 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 5. If the adversary were to attack flight 1, in all cases we get a positive reward and the adversary gets a negative reward. And this is it's the same, this is because we are on flight 1, the adversary is attacking 1, and it doesn't matter what other flights Air Marshals are on, whether they're on flight 2 and 3, 3 and 5, because they're not going to be able to come and help this Air Marshal who's on flight 1. And these targets are therefore independent, and so there's a lot of duplicates in this game matrix right here. Similarly, if the adversary were to attack flight 6, we get a negative reward -20, the adversary gets a positive reward 9. This is because it doesn't matter what combination we are on, 1, 3, 5, 1, 2, 3, etc. We are not on flight 6. These targets are independent. And so we can exploit this independence of targets by generating marginal representations. And so here, instead of 120 different x variables, we will only keep these 10 y variables. So we have one variable for probability on flight 1, one for flight 2, and so forth. There's 10 different y variables. Each y is really a sum over these x variables. So it's instead of, so this is the sum of all the different variables where we have probability of combination 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, etc. Instead, we are only going to maintain the probability of having an Air Marshal on flight 1. So we have a much smaller number of variables, and so we can now solve our program and get the probability of assigning Air Marshals to flights. The problem here, of course, is that we've given up all of the information about legal combinations of flights and so forth. Which means that if your Air Marshal could leave from New York, go to London, magically reappear in Paris, and come back to New York, this extension program can solve that problem. But real Air Marshals obviously don't have that property, and therefore we need to come up with a different approach. So we are going to sample directly from these variables, and we can prove that this works as long as the actual security allocation problem has certain properties, but it doesn't work in general. And so sampling becomes difficult if there are constraints on which flights the Air Marshal can take, like the spatial temporal constraints that I just talked about. So we needed a different approach. And the approach we went to is a Branch and Price approach from operations research. Now some of you may be very, very familiar with these approaches, but for the benefit of those who may not be, let me quickly give you a summary of what this approach does. And this is going to be a combination of branch and bound and column generation.
We're tending in one dimension.
No, great. And so the main idea that we are going to exploit here is the fact that the mixed strategy that we generate has a very small size support. So even though I said 10 to the power 13 different combinations of Air Marshals to flights, out of those 10 to the power 13 different potential x variables probabilities, only 100 might be positive. The rest of them may have a value of 0. So there is a way in which if we could incrementally generate solutions and only keep those 100 variables that are positive value, then we would be able to solve this problem. And that's what we are going towards with Branch and Price. And so let me start by first outlining the branch and bound component. So this is partition 1. These are all of the mixed strategies where the adversary's best response is to attack target 1. We are constructing another partition 2, where these are all of the mixed strategies where the adversary's best response is to attack target 2. So we just partition our problem into n separate partitions, and then we solve the problem partition by partition. So we say, what's the best mixed strategy here, the best here, the best here. We find the best of the best, and then we have solved the problem. all we've done is partition the problem and then solve it. This doesn't yield any speedups at all. But we know in AI we can organize things like this into a search tree, and once we have a search tree, we can do branch and bound search. So if this lower bound is higher than this upper bound, then we can prune all of these search nodes. So the only question is, how can we generate this upper bound? Now, I just talked to you about this idea of using marginals, which will work if the air marshals have magical properties of appearing and reappearing. But that's just a relaxation of the original problem. So we can solve using marginals, this node here using upper bound. And so basically we'll use the previous version of Iris for generating this upper bound solution, and then use that to prune the search tree. So at least we get some speedups from pruning in this way. But what I have not told you yet is that solving each individual node still requires us to solve a mixed integer program where the base is 10 to the power 13 pure strategies. We've, in this node, said that the adversary is going to attack flight 1. So we've fixed the adversary's response, but we're still trying to figure out what's the best mixed strategy given this adversary's best response is to attack flight 1. That still involves 10 to the power 13 pure strategies, that still involves 10 to the power 13 x variables, these xi variables. So the main observation, as I said, is the fact that many of these xi variables are 0. Out of those 10 to the power 13 xi variables, only 100 might have a positive value. And so the rest are 0. So we can do column generation. So we can start with a small number of pure strategies and then slowly grow it using a master-slave formulation that I will not have time to go into today. And then slowly grow our base of pure strategies so we have the right level of support. And we end when we have an optimal solution. Now, I'll show you here the obligatory slide as a computer scientist, which shows numbers of schedules growing on the x-axis and speed up in log scale on the y-axis. And so what we're showing you here is ours is better than the previous algorithm, except the previous algorithm is also ours in this case. So Iris 3 is better than Iris 2, it's faster. And branch and price, if you just opened an OR textbook and just took the solution from it directly without using any of the heuristics that we've outlined, then it doesn't manage to run in the time allocated. Now, if any of these problems is fed into Armor, it runs out of memory. So Iris, all this branch and price and so forth, was necessary to solve this problem, and this is what is in use by the Air Marshals today. So I know we are kind of running out of time, so I'll have to speed up a little bit. I do want to spend some time on evaluation of this work. But we've used these ideas for incremental growth in the number of pure strategies in solving problems for setting up checkpoints in the road network in Mumbai, for rail network, for social network. Basically, this is the double oracle approach. We start with a small game matrix, and then we slowly grow it by adding more and more strategies in the game matrix. So this is setting up one checkpoint on 2 roads, and then sort of keep growing that game matrix. So in fact, in November of 2008, Mumbai was attacked. Well, unfortunately, Mumbai gets attacked quite frequently. So I grew up in the city of Mumbai. In a visit to Mumbai, I saw these checkpoints being set up, which I understood were to be randomized checkpoints to thwart an attack of a similar type that happened in 2008. And so I came back to USC saying we can solve this problem. And so I started looking at this. So this is part of Mumbai. These are, let's say, 2 targets. Supposing the adversaries were to land here and then should try to get there to attack, where would you set up randomized checkpoints in this road network? So we solved this problem. In 2011, we were very happy that we could solve this problem. But it turned out to be a really, really small part of Mumbai. And so we really needed this whole big problem, which has 9,500 nodes, so many roads, so many checkpoints. And today, we can actually solve it in just about 20 minutes or so. So this is the whole area around Mumbai, and this is looking at all of the major roads and so forth. So armed with these results, I was very happy. This last month, I went to the Mumbai police headquarters. which I had not seen from the inside before. So it was like being inside, except in Bollywood movies. So it was like going inside a Bollywood movie and presenting, talking about John Nash and Stackelberg and so forth. It's kind of interesting, but there was a nice reception to these ideas, and so we'll see where we go with these. But let me explain to you why this works, why this double oracle approach works within this context. And this is again this idea of small support. So here we have two sources and two targets. And we are going to set up two checkpoints in a randomized fashion. So if you really thought about this problem, then, if you wanted to solve it by enumerating all the strategies, that's 150 choose two numbers of defender strategies. But if you solve it using a double oracle approach, we see that the checkpoints get set up only on these 6 separate road segments, 6 separate edges. The thickness of this red line is the probability with which that particular checkpoint gets set up. So what this is showing you is that even though there's 150 separate edges, the checkpoints are only getting concentrated on 6 of them. And if you change the payoff so that this one ends up having a higher payoff than this, the checkpoint shifts. So there's more probability of setting up checkpoints here, but the checkpoint on this road disappears. And once again, there's far fewer than 150 edges that get implicated. So basically, this double oracle approach is finding a small support. Now, we're looking for a theoretical justification for why we end up having a small support. This is just an experimental finding that in many of these real-world problems, the actual support for the mixed strategies tends to be small. And so we are very interested in seeing if somebody has a theoretical result that could justify why this happens. So let me now move on and take maybe 5 to 10 minutes talking about handling uncertainty. I will not be able to cover this in any detail, but hopefully I'll give you some sense of what is going on in our lab, and then I'll go on and talk about evaluation of this work. So one of the biggest challenges that we face, of course, that was brought out earlier, is the fact that an adversary may not act with perfect rationality. There may be bounded rationality as part of an adversary. So my colleague Sarit Krause, who I know is also affiliated with the University of Maryland here, raised this challenge of, okay, how would you handle the fact that an adversary may act with bounded rationality within our models? And so we wanted to test this idea by constructing a simulation of randomized security around LAX, and then releasing it to people and saying, could they attack the LAX airport? But we thought that this idea may not go over very well with the different people at LAX and so forth. So we came up with a different idea. And so this is a simulation game. It's Pirates and Treasure, but there's basically these 8 terminals at LAX. We give you 1 day of surveillance. The police are at terminals 2, 4, and 8. We give you a 2nd day of surveillance. The police are at terminals 2, 3, and 4. So we give you a month-long surveillance data, and then say, okay, which terminal would you choose to attack? And if you chose terminal 2, you were lucky, you got 5 points. If you chose terminal 1, you're unlucky, you lost 3 points. We paid people money if they succeeded in the attack, about 25 cents per point. And then, of course, took money away from people if they lost. And so we played, these games with lots of students at USC. We've played these games with, Amazon Mechanical Turk. My colleague Sarit Krause has tried this out with soldiers from the Israeli army and so forth. And so we have a lot of results that we've collected this way. And one of a set of results here, this is just a sample, was the original sort of results from 2009 that show you the use of anchoring bias and epsilon optimality. So this is showing on the x-axis, no surveillance, 5 days of surveillance, 20 days of surveillance, unlimited surveillance. On the y-axis is average expected defender reward. This is, after playing many games with many human subjects, we are looking at the total expected defender reward to us. The lower is worse, higher is better. So blue here is armor, red is uninformed random, it's just rolling dice. Blue is Praveen Parushali's thesis, red is rolling dice. So thankfully, blue is better than red. So somebody's thesis actually did work against human subjects. So that was a relief. But what's very interesting is that we found this green, which is Cobra, which is actually better. So blue is armor, which is supposed to be optimal, but Cobra is better against human subjects. And it is doing this by exploiting some biases in how humans solve this problem. Specifically, one bias that it exploits is this anchoring bias. So I'm going to play a strategy X, but even though I'm playing X, you're observing X prime. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. I tell you as a human subject that we are going to play a game and we are going to guard 8 gates in a randomized fashion. Well, the human is coming to the table saying, if there's 8 gates and 1 police officer, there is a 1/8 chance of having a police at each of these gates. Now I show you, it's not 1/8, it's not a uniform distribution. I keep showing you the surveillance data, it's not 1/8. The human being is anchored on 1/8, and no matter how many observations we show, they remain anchored on 1/8. So basically, we have a linear combination of, just one second, linear x prime, which is a linear combination of x, the strategy we play, and this uniform distribution. And let's go.
So, I mean, aren't the subjects starting with the uniform and then updating their uniform in some Bayesian way?
One would think so, right? That in fact, so the thought was that this alpha, so you're absolutely right. So the thought was that, alpha would start from 1, which is that they start with the uniform distribution under this condition. And then you're correct in sort of saying, well, shouldn't it get updated? And then once we come here, when there's unlimited observation, when we've given them this probability distribution, alpha would basically go to 0, and so you would have the actual observations. So what I show you is what you have observed. But in reality, what we observe is that even when you give them, here's the probability distribution we're playing, the algorithm that works better is one that assumes that people have come in with an anchoring bias. And so alpha of 1 actually does, alpha of 0.5 or something like that does better. And so it's just an interesting phenomenon, and we don't completely understand it, but that's just the way things have worked out.
The implementation is that the players do this in real time?
So players get to observe the simulations, and then after some time, we don't give them a time limit, and then they have to attack after observing many randomized allocations, so maybe 30 days of surveillance, attack.
If I were potential attacker, wouldn't I collect the data and go to my computer and try to generate
So, that's...
So what I'm trying to say is that although this may be interesting and certainly thought-provoking, it may not reflect really what happens in the field.
So that's a very, very interesting observation. And the best, I guess, we have to go to subject matter experts as to what exactly is available. But you're pointing out something very interesting, which is that really there is a multi-objective optimization problem. So what we are trying to say is that if the adversary is going to act perfect, sort of in their best interest with perfect rationality, then we want to do as best against them as possible. But if the adversary were to deviate, then we don't want to give up a lot. And algorithms like armor are in that sense, going to perform best against the perfectly rational adversary. But they may be very, very brittle if the adversary were to deviate. And so we want to find that sweet spot where even if there is some deviation, we are not going to lose a lot. And so that's basically where we are. And as you'll see, some of these algorithms are going to try to do that. But to the extent that we can know where we are in that spectrum, the better it will be. But we don't want to be at this other edge where we are totally robust, assuming that the adversary can do anything. But
if you want to attack the AX, then you can do this on the spur of the moment because you got nothing else to do at night.
That's right, that's right. The colleague I have, the psychologist that I work with, Richard John and so forth, we've had a lot of discussions about this. And his point is that no matter, there's some inherent boundary rational process here. And that even if you give these people a lot of time, everything else, in the end, you are not going to get that, get that perfect answer. And this is just the way it is going to be. And so even when we play this against supposed experts, these military officers from the army and so forth, the algorithm that tends to perform better is not the one that.
So this is a well-known problem, right?
Yeah.
That it goes under the name every more information, not the way better.
So
In game theory, Aumann and Israel, there's a whole group working on
And but this is a, so I don't know if you're running out of time, it's 11:55, okay. So let me spend 5 more minutes on this and then I'll come to evaluation. So, and there's this notion of epsilon optimalities, basically saying that an adversary may not pick the target with the maximum expected reward, but one with an epsilon of thought. But this was sort of our own idea. This was part of a thesis of my student James Spida. And then another student, Ron Yang, came on the scene, and she picked up this idea from Caltech. McCallum-Palfrey quantum response goes back to McFadden's work on discrete choice and so forth. The basic idea is that obviously the adversary is not maximizing expected value, but they are doing the stochastic choice. A better choice is more likely, but a lower value choice does not have a 0 probability. There's some probability that the adversary may still go after something of lower value. And so basically in the probability that an adversary will choose a target is given by this formulation here, which is the basic formulation that's used in this quantum response model. So she used this to generate a newer set of algorithms, and she was able to show, so again, these are 4 separate games, but we've done many experiments with many different settings. This is average defender expected reward on the y-axis. Again, higher is better, lower is worse. And this is quantum response in red. And this is armor, and so quantum response is better than armor. Quantum response is also better than the Cobra algorithm. And she was able to generate a fast algorithm, even though this is a nonlinear, non-convex kind of objective function. So in this case, she was able to produce a result that's much better than Cobra. So in our research group meetings, we had Ron presenting these results, and James kind of feeling, sad that look at my algorithm from my thesis was beaten. So for a year, he sort of looked at Ron presenting these results and trying to figure out how he could do better than quantum response. And so finally came back with this idea that I'm just not going to worry about modeling human decision making. I care about as a defender, my expected reward. I'm going to simplify the problem considerably and just bound my loss. I just don't care about trying to come up with a better and better model of how this human adversary is going to think. And so this is the same armor program, but now I'm going to add an additional constraint. And this is where we get back to the multi-objective. So this is trying to just maximize my expected payoff as a defender. I'm just going to add an additional condition that says that if the adversary were to deviate from optimal and lose some value, then I'm also willing to lose some value. So if the adversary is going to give up 1 point, at most I'm willing to give up 1 point. If the adversary is willing to give up 10 points, at most I'm willing to give up 10 points. And so I'm going to bound my loss if the adversary deviates from optimal. And with this, he was able to show over 100 games with, again, lots of human subjects with statistical significance, match his algorithm, outperformed Cobra, outperformed quantum response in 42 games, and quantum response only in 6. So he was able to outdo Ron's work, and he was able to present these results. And now it was Ron's turn to feel sad, and then James cleverly decided that he wanted to be done with his PhD and leave USC, which did. But we were left with this challenge of should we go with robustness, James' work, but model decision making as in Ron's work. And it was good that James left because right afterwards brought him back. We came back to this idea of having subject. If we could use a different utility function instead of expected value, then again we find that quantum response beams match. So now we are at this very interesting juncture where, on the one hand, we could imagine generating a detailed model of a human subject and using that versus a robust response kind of approach. And trying to figure out which one would work better is going to be an interesting challenge. And so that's something that remains a topic for further investigation. So let me now wrap this. There's a lot more I can keep talking about, but let me go to the last part of the talk, which is evaluation, which is critical in this kind of work. For 25 years I've been writing papers in AI, and I know how to write those kinds of papers where if I've generated a new algorithm, I look at 100 inputs to the algorithm and the algorithm that was there previously, and then I compare the two in terms of average speed up, average runtime or average solution quality, and show that my algorithm is better than what was there previously, and so on. So that works, that's great. But once you go into this application track, suddenly now the evaluation, we are lucky that our algorithms are being used, but this evaluation is no longer enough. We have to really check this, whether these systems work in the real world. But this is not easy, of course, because you cannot do controlled experiments, and there can be no proof of 100% security, like you were saying earlier. So the question is, what can we do? So our approach has been to ask, are we better off with what we have done than what was there previously? And we've looked at it in many different ways. We've looked at it using simulations, using a machine learning attacker. We've looked at using human adversaries in the lab, like I showed you previously. We've looked at the actual schedules that were generated by security agencies before and after and compared them. We've had adversary teams, that is people who simulate being terrorist attack, sort of mock attack locations before and after our systems were deployed. We have some actual data from our deployments, and we have some domain expert evaluation and so on. So with all of these, we can conclude the following. I'll show you some of this data. I won't have time to go into all of it. Against human schedulers, we are better off because human schedulers tend to fall into predictable patterns. This is well known. I mean, it's well known in psychology that humans are bad at generating randomized patterns. This was seen at LA with the Air Marshals. There's actually a Government Accountability Office report number this that talks about the Air Marshal deployment being predictable. And this is because for a human being, it's a huge scheduling burden. If you think about the task of generating legal schedules for air marshals, taking into account off hours, duty hours, risks of flights and so forth, and then on top of that tell the person, hey, you have to generate a randomized schedule. This is a huge cognitive burden for a human scheduler, and software is just better at it. If you think about just rolling dice and doing whatever you want, then that is non-weighted. Officers will be sent to places where there's no person there to protect, for example. We could do simple weighted random, but again, basically we're really not taking into account how an adversary will react. Now, the final point I want to make here is that we have multiple deployments over multiple years at multiple locations, and there's no way for me sitting at USC to ask the Coast Guard in New York to use my software. And so the very fact that it is in use to us tells us that there must be some value to the software being used. And these go through their own internal evaluations, such as the Blue Ribbon panel that I mentioned at LAS. So let me just quickly run through some of this supportive data. This is in simulation, so this is just replicating in simulation. This is 20 schedules, 50, 150 and 250 schedules. So what we are doing here is assigning air marshals to flights in simulation and having a simulated attacker attack the flights after doing surveillance. And we can do different ways of allocating air marshals to flights. Uniform random, different kinds of weighted random, and iris. And what you see is that iris has a higher defender expected reward than any of these other simple methods. And this is to be expected because it is, again, a hierarchic method. It is taking into account how an adversary will react to whatever it is that we do. This is, we've done similar work with other installations. This is actual schedules before and after our system was deployed. This is from the Port of Boston. This is different days of the week. This is averaged over many, many weeks. And this is count. And since this is the actual count of the Coast Guard patrols, this is blank count. This is showing you this blue line, for example, how many times a particular boat, this patrolling boat visited a particular target. So, it sort of visited this target more times here, then less times here, then more times here, and so on and so forth. So there are 2 points you can see from these schedules. One, there's far fewer schedules on day 2, and 2, all these lines crisscross, which means that a target was not, even if it was more important, it was not consistently visited more frequently. Sometimes it was visited often, sometimes it was visited less often. After our program was installed, you can see that the more important targets were visited more frequently, the less important targets were visited less frequently, so you don't have this crisscross of sometimes a target is important, sometimes a target is not important. And also, obviously, this particular pattern in how a human would deploy has gone away. And so this is showing you that these schedules that we've generated tend to be superior than what was done previously with the human schedules. There's other kinds of things. So for example, in Boston, they had this mock attacker team that would try to see how easy it is to attack the port before and after. And there's a report that talks about deterrence improving afterwards when they were deployed. From before to after protect, there's actual reports of illegal activities in the port before they were done. And this comments from industry port partners that the Coast Guard seemed to be everywhere all the time, when in fact, there wasn't an increase in the number of boats. All that was changed was the schedules, and that gave the perception that there was an increase in the number of resources available, which is what we would want. We've done some not controlled experiments, but this is some data that we have. This is from the Trust program. This is checking people on trains for tickets. So for 3 weeks, if you look at the human generated schedule versus our schedule, and we send out these officers to check people, to catch people who are traveling without tickets. We have fewer officers allocated to us, this 2.89 versus 20. So there's more officers allocated to this side. But nonetheless, if you look at citations per officer, we get more catches. So we are catching more people with our schedules than with the human generated schedule. And this is because we are more frequently at the right place at the right time compared to a human generated schedule. This is now really not a controlled experiment. This is 4 years of data of armor of catching people traveling with guns, drugs, and so forth. And there's a big increase in the number of arrests. Now, here, there's a lot of factors that could be going on. A lot of changes in the economy and all kinds of things like that. The main point that comes up that I want to make here is that these checkpoints are doing something useful for the city of Los Angeles. So it seems, I'm not completely sure. I mean, there's a big war going on in the south of the border, and so who knows, how that influences. But one of the things we heard is that once the news got out that there are these checkpoints and a lot of arrests are being made, then things started dropping. Because there's a lot of local news saying these checkpoints are generating all these arrests and so forth. So that's why.
So that means that didn't go through LAX.
That's right. But that's and I have a lot to say about that in terms of how people at LAX sort of say, well,
Sure. Very good.
So this is bragging, but this is mainly to show you that these programs are being of value, considered to be valuable. So this is a commendation from the City of Los Angeles to our research team, an Operational Excellence Award from the U.S. Coast Guard in Boston, a certificate of appreciation from the U.S. Federal Air Marshals. And these are just to tell you that these programs are actually being valued, and our science, our game theory, computational game theory, AI, and so forth, are contributing in some useful ways to these agencies. So I have a small video. If I have 1 minute, I can, or maybe I should just go on. Okay. So if you're interested, I can show it to you later.
We will have a round table at 2 to 3.
Okay. So to quickly summarize that, these programs, Armor, Iris, Protect, Trust, these are just the beginning. I've talked about many ideas that we've used in speeding them up. But there's major future domains and challenges, continuous space and time for protecting quarters and tigers. Our colleagues in Singapore are trying to think about route controls on trains there. There's a massive rail network, so scale up remains a major challenge. This is joint work with many, many people, current students and postdocs, former students and postdocs, many, many collaborators from USC and from across many different universities. And thanks to PA, the Homeland Security Center, and to our research office. So thank you.
Unfortunately, they have made some sort of muddle on the schedule, and somebody else can come here. So there will be a round table here. You're welcome to come. But I have a lot of questions myself. If there's somebody who has a real good question, answer it. And Milind can ask me now.
Don't rush, we move.
Oh, thank you, Ed. So then we can have questions. Because usually myself for 1 hour and a half. Any questions? So I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
It's well known in game theory, it's a famous book, okay, by Well. It's my favorite book on the subject, that links game theory to intelligence and randomness. It's very much related to what you say. And his position is that the more predictable you are, right, the more stupid you go. So his formulation of intelligence is I play a game against the world. And if they figure out what I'm going to do, then they can run around me. So he says, occasionally it's be very helpful to act unpredictably with, and he goes very far, like with your wife, with your employer, with your colleagues, and so on and so forth. And he says humans, most likely, if you act unpredictably, they think you're very smart. So the question to you is, and this is related to the so-called triple game in the stock market. In other words, can I guess where most of the people will not guess where I will go? That's very relevant to this discussion. Anything, we have 2 people here. Anything along these lines that goes in this question of games with adversaries that runs people try to model that way? Because you have a game between adversaries and teams, but then you have another game, who's going to predict the other one?
I can give you examples of games where it is advantageous to be predictable. They're non-zero sum games, however.
Oh, there's a one, okay, I'd like to know
So-
those, right?
What would be one example?
Prisoner's dilemma.
Prisoner's dilemma, yeah.
Yeah. Actually, the repeated prisoner's dilemma, of course.
Yeah, right. So, okay, that's good.
So I guess
Anything about triple game formulation here, where you want to not be able to be predicted where people will predict you go, because this, I can tell you, formalisms in stock market algorithms is used.
I mean, I would first love to hear about this book, but to get more details of the book. But our work is completely based on, trying to be unpredictable.
Yeah.
And so it's all trying to really introduce randomness into defender allocations and patrols and so on and so forth. What's very interesting there, though, this is where you may be going, is that because it is truly random. Now, what happens
What is truly random?
Meaning it's not human random, which is when you ask a human subject to go with a random, right? They may say on, off. That's kind of considered random. And so you might find from the defender side and the attacker side particular biases. So, for example, when the program was first deployed, it could potentially just generate by chance the fact that we'll set up a checkpoint on the same road, same time, multiple times in a sequence. And immediately there's a call back from the airport saying that there's something wrong with the program because it's not being random, because random meant it had to change and it was not changing. So there could be a sense of trying to educate the defenders. But then from an attacker perspective also, my colleague Richard John has been talking to me about intentionally introducing randomness, because you might have a string of, okay, we are always going to do one patrol because it's supposed that, it could just happen. It's the same patrol 4 or 5 days in a week, in a string. An adversary conducting surveillance may get the wrong impression, and that, you always do only one sort of patrol, and therefore may not get that deterrent effect that we want. And therefore we may want to intentionally kind of flip patrols, even though, so we sort of introduce more artificial kind of changing of schedules and so forth. Because from a human surveillance perspective, given their limited surveillance and so forth, if you want to get the right kind of deterrent effect, we might want to do that. So that's something that, again, is sort of a fascinating topic, but that's something we've not done.
What's that to do with the time scale to which the observations are taking place?
That's right.
Versus the time scale at which the action will be taking place.
That's right, because the distribution is drawn assuming an infinite time horizon, whereas the adversary is acting, observing over a smaller time.
So that's one point. The second one is that in your verification section, you have a number of methodologies to do that. But was it the case that the adversaries had knowledge of the algorithms that you were using because I could make the following argument.
Please.
That I heard on the radio that USC was involved. I go to your website, I download all the papers,
Yeah.
and I get a sense as to what you're out there.
Right.
Aren't you then saying it's super?
No, because the assumption in Stackelberg games, of course, is that you know my distribution. So we are starting out with the position that you completely know what we are going to be doing. I mean, in a mixed strategy sense, you know my mixed strategy. So in a sense, you're sort of assuming the worst, and so therefore we are not at a loss if you get a hold of our algorithms.
Any other questions?
There's no way I can use that in that knowledge. Going back to John's point.
Yeah, but there's more coming. There's another weakness, okay? It goes like this. This has been surfaced recently in articles on the mathematics of searching on the web. So in one line, I'm willing to bet anything I have in the long term that the correct way of thinking about this problem is to neglect the human modeling and go with robustness. For the following reasons, okay? Because it's impossible. What they are showing is that when all these things that they do on the web, trying to predict humans and all that stuff, it's impossible to figure out what happens in repeated observations of the same data in the human brain. For a very simple reason, humans are non-causal. There's a whole philosophy and theory about that. I come from engineering, so I got my stupidity displayed in some conferences early on in my life, where you go and you write models for humans, which are like the ones we use in engineering. So what is the engineering model? They say, if I have the input and the state, I can predict the output, not for humans. The moment they observe something, they change their behavior, and they keep changing again and again and again. And that's why Hassani and others have gone into this repeated learning model, but they still have not captured it. So the most recent work on researching on the web says, no, forget that. We want to use something different than just this trying to model. When Armand said, okay, I'm interested in a paper on game theory, is this web page relevant? And then is the other one page? And then I asked the first question again, you're not going to get the same answer.
John, believe it or not, I can give you a counterexample of this too, and it is rock, paper, scissors.
Yeah, but these are very simple. Okay, so what I forgot to say, and thanks for correcting me, is that for large populations, right? For large populations, trying to model behavior statistically or otherwise is not going to make it. It's much better to go with the robustness argument, although conservative, you're going to get better results. And I think I'm going to bet that the student of yours is going to come in the latest results and beat that, and then you're going to go back and forth. Right?
That's right. That's right.
That's
But you're saying in the long run,
right.
robustness is the way to go. I mean, for now, for us, it's a very interesting open question. And
It's a very good situation to be that you have an excellent result this year, and in 2 years you have another excellent result, and another one, and then another.
That's right. So no, but this is a way, and perhaps there's a way in which this can be intelligently combined and so on and so forth. So there's a lot more to be done.
What's your view on this? For large games with humans, does it pay to try to model the humans?
It depends on the game. My answer to that would be very complicated, and I don't think I can explain it all in one sentence.
Because this is, I know for many situations, and definitely lately in the stock market, they are going into much more sophisticated models as far as human behavior. Anyway, any other questions?
That's right. That's right.
Because the stock market, after all, is a game. But, any other questions?
And the quantum response model happens to be at the simpler end of those more complicated models. Yeah.
And people have actually said, okay, sure, for social behavior, for many of these problems, empirical studies and collecting data is very important, but how do you make sure that the collections you have is not already biased towards one behavior or the other? That's another game theoretic method that we are playing here. Finally, I have to give you a new application that may be interesting to the audience, okay? So how many of you have taken a ticket from a camera, traffic camera? Okay. How many of you know that they're actually going to make the cameras mobile? So there are two applications here. Okay. One is for the police, try to make them so that they maximize the real effect, which is not really the money. It's trying to make sure people they obey the speeds. And The other is for us, common folks, give us an application, we can put it down and figure out which way to go so that we avoid the camera. Because they're gonna make them mobile.
They have an online, right, website that posts where the cameras are.
No, but now they're gonna make them mobile.
So what, someone else will go online and put a new location on the
They're
camera?
changing them every 2 days, they guys say, I understand. They're gonna change every 2 days, so that's gonna be.
They might like put in like false information.
But, you know,
It will
it's
produce.
a similar kind of game like this, right? Because you have resources, you put them where you find, and what the other side does, try to avoid them.
So one of my colleagues has told me that this speed traps and so forth is not a profitable business to be in for us, because you always catch people, no matter how stupid a strategy you use. So his advice was, don't go after that apple. That's right. How to advise them using the strategies.
If you can put an application where when I get my GPS, it starts showing me every day where it is, you'll save me a lot of money, because I'm very bad with this. Okay, so if you like to, you are all welcome to come at 2 to 3. We'll discuss this in some of the more technical aspects. And thanks for coming.